Short is the story, long is the life.
Wukong's archive presents China Urban Legends, the Guishan Han Tomb of Xuzhou. In the autumn of 2004, my work unit transferred me from Beijing to Xuzhou, saying they wanted me to organize infrastructure archives. The Xuzhou train station was an old one, and the exit was swarming with touts, tricycle drivers, van drivers, all yelling at the top of their lungs, Jiuli Mountain. Pengzhuang. I stood in the square in front of the station for a while and saw a clock perched on top of the post office building across the way. The hands would tick along, then lag half a beat, like it couldn't catch its breath. The dormitory my unit assigned me was at the foot of Jiuli Mountain, in a place called Shitun. The dorm was an early 3-story red brick building from the mining bureau. Honeycomb coal briquettes were stacked in the hallway, and the wall had save water painted on it, faded to a washed-out gray. Downstairs, facing the street, there was a bike repair shop with a battered awning. The owner was surnamed Zhou, in his 60s, a local who'd lived at the foot of Jiuli Mountain for most of his life. The first time I went to him to pump up a tire, he squatted on the ground and told me a whole story about Guishan, and from then on I never forgot the name. Old Zhou's repair shop wasn't big. Tires and batteries were piled on the floor, and 2 rows of wrenches hung on the wall, all greasy. When he inflated my tire, he first ran his thumb over the valve stem and said, "This tire of yours has a slow leak, you ought to get it patched up later." I offered him a cigarette, and he squatted at the shop entrance, talking with me from Jiuli Mountain to Guishan, one conversation that lasted the whole afternoon. People from Xuzhou talk slowly, their words dragging at the end, like the wind on the mountain, coming in gusts. Old Zhou said Guishan was just west of Jiuli Mountain, across a gully. The mountain was shaped like a turtle lying on its belly, head facing south, tail facing north, 4 legs sunk into the earth. Xuzhou has a lot of mountains, none of them tall, just dirt mounds really, but Guishan was different. There'd been talk about it since the old generations. Old Zhou said people in his grandfather's day said something was pressed down beneath Guishan. The turtle was there to hold the mountain could move, but the turtle could not. If the turtle ever moved, whatever was down there would come out. In 1992, the Guishan Han Tomb opened to the public. Old Zhou said after that, the stories about Guishan only multiplied.
I asked him, "Have you been there?" He said, "Of course I have. When I was young, I set off blasting charges on that mountain." I said, "Blasting charges?" He said, "Quarrying. Guishan used to be a quarry. The brickyards and stone yards all over Jiuli Mountain depended on it. If it weren't for the blasting, this tomb might have stayed buried for who knows how many more years."
He paused, then said, "That tomb, it was blown open." In the winter of 1981, the Jiuli quarry set off explosives to mine stone on the southern slope of Turtle Mountain. Old Zhou said he was just past 20 back then, hauling a cart at the yard. That afternoon, after the second blast went off and before the smoke had even cleared, Oldly, the man who set the charges, yelled out, "We found something." A hole had been blasted open halfway up the mountainside, black and gaping, like the mountain had opened an eye. Among the rubble scattered around the opening were neat, rectangular stone slabs, squared off and even, clearly not natural formations. Oldly held up a kerosene lantern and shone it into the hole, but the light didn't reach the bottom. All he could see was a perfectly straight passage leading inward, with smooth walls on both sides, carved by human hands. The men at the yard all started talking at once. Some said it was a bomb shelter, others said an old mine shaft. Bold Oldly wanted to go down and take a look, but the factory director stopped him. Report it up the chain. This isn't something we're allowed to touch." That very night, people came from the county. They strung a rope around the opening and posted a guard. Old Zhou said he went over to gawk as well, squatting outside the rope and hearing a low moaning sound coming from inside the hole, like wind, but not quite wind. Old Sun, the night watchman, crouched by the opening smoking. He smoked until the middle of the night, then suddenly stood up, stubbed out his cigarette, and said, "There's someone talking in there." Old Zhou said he didn't dare to respond. Old Sun spoke again. "He's been calling for a long time, calling, come in." The next day, Old Sun didn't show up. A young man took over the night watch. The young man said Old Sun had gone home that night and come down with a fever. It burned for 3 days, and he kept muttering nonsense non-stop, just one phrase, over and over, "He's calling me, he's calling me." Old Zhou paused here, twisted the wrench in his hand, and said, "This all happened after liberation. But if you go further back, the things on Turtle Mountain get a lot more sinister."
What he meant was a story his grandfather had told him. In the 30-something years of the Republic, one time, 3 out-of-towners went up Turtle Mountain at night, carrying flashlights, ropes, and shovels. They stayed on the mountain the whole night. When dawn came, only one came down, hair in disarray, face covered in bloody scratches, self-inflicted. That man had gone mad. He grabbed anyone he saw and asked, "He's calling me. Did you hear it? He's calling me." That man later died in a shack behind the mountain. Old Zhou's grandfather said the 3 had come from Luoyang, and their trade was propping the pot, grave robbing. 3 went in, 1 came out, and the one who came out was insane. As for what they'd encountered in that cave, no one knew. What exactly happened on Turtle Mountain that night, no one knew either.
Later, people came from the county, hauling an iron gate frame on a truck. They welded it shut over the opening and put a big padlock on it, keyhole facing down, sealed with a paper strip. Old Zhou said he squatted at the bottom of the slope watching for a long time. He could see a red stamp on the seal, and when the wind blew, it rattled and flapped. That winter, word spread through every village at the foot of Jiuli. Turtle Mountain had opened its mouth. The old folks shook their heads when they heard it and said, "When a mountain opens its mouth, it's no good omen. When a mountain opens its mouth, it's going to spit something out." That saying hadn't been around 2 years when, in the winter of 1983, the brick factory on the northern slope of Turtle Mountain was digging for clay and unearthed a stretch of blue brick tunnel, directly opposite the hole on the southern slope, the two facing each other across the mountain. The county sent people again and sealed off the north slope too. Old Zhou said the elders of his grandfather's generation used to say, "Under Turtle Mountain, the south slope and the north slope are connected, one is the entrance, one is the exit. The south slope is the front door, the north slope is the back door. As for what goes in and out through that door, no one knows." In the spring of 1992, the Guishan Han Tomb was officially opened to the public. Old Zhou said that for the first couple of years, the archaeological team would stay up on the mountain for over half a year at a stretch. He lived at the foot of the mountain and would bring water to the work site every few days, so he got to know the team pretty well.
He told me the story of the tomb. The tomb owner was a Chu king of the Western Han Dynasty, named Lu Zhu, with the posthumous title King Xiang. During the Western Han, Xuzhou was the state of Chu, and the Chu king was a regional lord whose fief was centered around Pengcheng. Lu Zhu was the 6th-generation Chu king, reigning for over a decade. Before his death, he had his tomb built, and the construction took 13 years. The tomb was cut into the southern slope of Guishan Mountain, carving a chamber into the rock. They literally hollowed out an underground palace from the belly of the stone mountain.
I said, "So it's just a big cave?"
Old Zhou said, "Go see for yourself. It's not a cave. It's a house. 15 rooms, living room, bedroom, kitchen, storeroom, everything you'd need, even a toilet. A house from 2,000 years ago, hidden inside the belly of a mountain."
He said an old professor on the archaeological team walked around inside the tomb, came out, and told people one thing: this wasn't built for people to live in. I said, it wasn't built for the living, it was built for the dead.
Old Zhou said, it wasn't built for the dead either. The old professor said there was something off about the tomb, it was too elaborate. So elaborate it didn't feel like a tomb at all. I didn't understand at the time. Later, I went to the Guishan Han Tomb myself and finally understood what Old Zhou meant by something off. Entering through the mountain gate, there's a long corridor first, running from the tomb entrance all the way to the main chamber, 56 meters long, 1 meter 78 tall, 1 meter 6 wide. When you walk in, there's barely a fist's width between your head and the stone ceiling, and the stone walls on both sides are smooth as glass, like they'd been planed down with a carpenter's plane. The creepiest thing is how terrifyingly straight this corridor is, 2,000 years ago, with no instruments, no spirit levels, just pure manual labor. The craftsman cut a 56-meter corridor with a centerline deviation of less than 5 millimeters. 5 millimeters, that's about the thickness of a pinky fingernail. 2,000 years, and that's the margin of error.
Old Zhou said the archaeological team measured it with a laser device and didn't speak for a long time. Then a young team member said, "If this weren't from the Han Dynasty, I'd think it was cut by a machine."
Then there were the ceiling stones. At the corridor entrance, 26 massive stones, stacked from the inside out, sealed the passage completely. Each one was over a person's height, weighing 6 or 7 tons, arranged in 2 neat layers. You couldn't even slide a knife blade into the gaps between them. Later, the archaeological team found 2 parallel shallow grooves on the ground at the bottom of the corridor, running from the position of the ceiling stones all the way to the tomb entrance. Experts said those were slide marks left when the ceiling stones were pushed in, 2,000 years ago. The craftsmen first laid a layer of fine sand on the corridor, then placed logs on top, and used manpower to roll the 6-ton stones in one by one. That makes sense. But Old Zhou said he once overheard an old team member mutter something. The sand was wet. How could sand from 2,000 years ago still be wet? Even the old team member thought it sounded absurd after saying it, and waved his hand, saying, "I'm just talking nonsense. Don't take it seriously."
I asked Old Zhou, how did they get the stones in?
Old Zhou said, "You've hit the key question. From the outside, pushed in one by one. After they were all in place, the tomb entrance was sealed with rammed earth, leaving no trace on the outside."
I said, then how did the tomb builders get out?
Old Zhou looked at me and said, "That's the weird part. Once the ceiling stones were in place, there was absolutely no way to open them from the inside. So the craftsmen, how did they manage to push the last batch in from outside and then get back out themselves? Unless, for that last batch, someone was waiting inside to receive it." The most famous thing about the Guishan Han Tomb isn't the tunnel or the ceiling stones, it's a pair of relief carvings on the cliff face above the southern tunnel entrance. When Old Zhou took me to see them, it was afternoon. The sun was slanting west, its light falling diagonally across the cliff. The 2 human figures were clear as day, one on the left, one on the right. The left one was taller, the right one shorter. Both faced south, like 2 people standing at a doorway welcoming guests. The old locals called them the king and his servant. Later, when the tomb opened to visitors, the tour guide script called them the king of Chu welcomes guests.
I asked, these were carved?
Old Zhou said, "Carved. But some say they're natural formations."
He told me that from the day they were discovered, no one could say for sure. If they were carved, they were seamlessly fused with the surrounding rock, no tool marks to be found. If they were natural, then the 2 figures were too human-like, the taller one even had a slight stoop, as if bending forward to usher a guest inside.
In 1997, experts were brought in to examine them. Their conclusion was vague: they should be naturally formed, with slight later human modification. But Old Zhou didn't buy it. He said he'd grown up at the foot of Guishan, and he'd been looking at those 2 figures for decades, sometimes he saw two people, and sometimes he saw one.
I said, one person?
Old Zhou said, on overcast days, when the light is dim, inside the shadow of the taller figure you can make out another shadow, pressed up against it. Like two people stacked together. The old folks in the village said it wasn't the king and his servant, it was the king and his shadow. The king standing in front, and his shadow, come to life on its own. I later made a point of going to look on an overcast day. The sky was so gray it felt like it might drip. The two figures on the cliff were blurry and indistinct. I stared for over 10 minutes until my eyes ached. Just as I was rubbing them, I suddenly felt that there was indeed another shadow nested inside the taller one, pressed close, like someone standing behind him, on tiptoe, chin resting on his shoulder. I blinked and looked again. Nothing. The sun leaked through a crack in the clouds, and the two figures were sharp and clear, one tall, one short, like two people who'd been standing at a doorway for thousands of years, waiting for someone.
I said, where did all this come from?
Old Zhou said, not from me. It was from the 70s, a technician from the Geological Survey team, surnamed Qian. In the 1970s, a geological team came to Guishan to survey, pitching tents on the mountain and staying for over a month. Technician Qian was from Shanghai. He wore glasses and was the type to split hairs. During the day he traced maps, at night, with nothing to do, he'd squat on the southern slope staring at that cliff. After a week of this, he told his teammates, those two figures, they change.
He said that in the morning, the two figures faced south. But in the evening, near sunset, the shorter one seemed to have turned its face now pointing west.
His teammates laughed at him, said he was going crazy. Technician Qian didn't argue. He just went out to look every evening at dusk. Then one day, he came back pale as a sheet, packed his things, and said he was leaving, this place wasn't safe to stay. The team couldn't stop him, and he really left, without even collecting his pay.
I asked Old Zhou, what happened to Technician Qian after that?
Old Zhou said, word was he was transferred back to Shanghai, and within 2 years he was out on medical retirement. Some said he'd gone mad, some said he hadn't. Either way, no one ever saw him again.
I said, so what did he see himself?
Old Zhou said, he never said. The day he left the team with one sentence, he said, that shorter one isn't a servant. It's a child. Back when they were excavating in 1992, Old Zhou had stood night watch for the archaeological team.
He said the team had strict rules, work during the day, seal off the mountain at night, with 2 people left at the site to keep an eye on the tools and materials. Old Zhou was a local, knew the roads well, so he'd pulled a few night shifts with them. The first few nights were fine. On the 4th night, something happened.
That night, in the small hours, Old Zhou was squatting in the work shed wrapped in his coat when he suddenly heard a muffled thud from deep inside the mountain, dong. Like someone, far away, picking up a big boulder and setting it back down. Old Zhou said he didn't think much of it at the time. Figured it was leftover blasting noise, or just the mountain shifting on its own. Jiuli Mountain, this whole stretch, it's a rocky mountain, and at night it'd sometimes make sounds. The old-timers called it the mountain sighing. But then, another one. Dong. This one was clearer than the first, like it was traveling through the ground itself, coming from the direction of the tomb passage. Then a third, a fourth, dong, dong, dong. One after another, rhythmic, neither fast nor slow. Like someone carrying something heavy, walking step by step. Old Zhou said every hair on his body stood up. He grabbed a flashlight, stepped out of the shed, and headed toward the tomb passage entrance. By the time he reached the opening, the sound had suddenly stopped. He shone the light inside, the corridor was empty, both walls smooth, not even a shadow. He crouched at the entrance and listened for a while. Nothing. So he went back. But he'd barely lain down for half an hour when the sound started up again. This time he heard it clearly, not single beats, but paired ones. Dong, dong. Pause. Dong, dong. Like two people, carrying something between them, walking step by step, deeper into the mountain's belly. Old Zhou said he didn't sleep a wink that night. Early the next morning, he went to find the head of the archaeological team and told him there was activity in the tomb at night. The team leader was from Nanjing, wore a straw hat. He listened, then said very politely, "That's groundwater, water in the cracks of the rock, freezes and expands at night, makes noise. Nothing to worry about." Old Zhou said, the team leader was right, and I believed him. But later I went back to check on my own. On the ceiling stone at the tomb passage entrance, the third block, lower right corner, there was a fresh scratch. About half a foot long, grayish-white, a new mark. Like something had scraped it from the inside, with a fingernail. Old Zhou said he didn't dare mention it to the archaeological team at the time. He was afraid if he told them, they'd think he was superstitious. But he remembered that stone. Later, when the Han tomb opened to the public, he'd look at that ceiling stone every time he went, and that scratch was always there. Old Zhou also said that once, when he just couldn't hold it in anymore, he told the team leader about the scratch. The team leader didn't laugh at him. The next morning, he brought Old Zhou along to take a look. The team leader crouched in front of the ceiling stone and studied it for a long while, then pulled a piece of chalk from his pocket and drew a circle next to the scratch. Old Zhou said, "I thought he was going to measure something." But after drawing the circle, the team leader stood up and said, "Don't touch it for now. I'll come back in a couple of days to check again." 2 days later, the team leader did come back. The circle was still there. The scratch was still there. But inside the circle, there was now half a fingerprint, like someone had crouched there, braced a hand on the ceiling stone, and pressed a fingertip against the surface. The print was bigger than a normal person's, the ridges thick and deep. Old Zhou said he compared it with his own finger, it was a world of difference. The team leader stared at that half fingerprint for a long time, and finally said, "From now on, don't let any outsiders in here." After that, the archaeological team guarded the tomb passage entrance even more strictly. During my years in Xuzhou, I visited the Guishan Han Tomb more than once. One time, after the place closed, Old Zhou led me in through the side entrance to have tea with the caretaker, Old Sun. Old Sun had guarded the Guishan Han Tomb for 8 years. He had a dark face and didn't talk much. The three of us sat in the ticket office drinking tea. It was made from tea dregs and tasted bitter. Old Sun heard I was from Beijing and asked me, "Do you believe it?"
I said, "Believe what?" He said, "Believe that there's someone in this tomb." I said, "There's no one in the tomb. There are bones." Old Sun said, "If only there were bones. What I'm afraid of is, no bones at all." He told me this story. In the winter of 2001, close to the new year, there was hardly anyone in the grounds. As usual, he did his evening patrol, and when he reached the entrance of the south corridor, he saw something on the ground, a pale blue-white object, glinting under the light. He picked it up and looked at it. It was a piece of jade, about the size of a fingernail, with a smooth polished edge, as if it had fallen off some ornament. Old Sun said, "I picked it up and felt something was off. This place sees so many visitors every day, if a tourist had dropped it, someone would have grabbed it by now." He clutched the jade, walked back to the ticket office, and the more he thought about it, the more wrong it felt. I'd patrolled this path for 8 years. I could walk it with my eyes closed. Yesterday it wasn't there.
The next day he handed the jade piece over. The people at the cultural center looked at it for a long time and said the jade was old. A Han Dynasty item, with a character carved into it that looked like Lu, though not exactly. After that, the jade piece was taken away, and there was never any follow-up.
Old Sun said, "From then on, I felt like there was something in this place following me. He said it didn't mean him any harm, it just followed. Whenever he made his night rounds, no matter where he went, he felt someone behind him. He'd turn around empty, nothing there. One time he stood at the entrance of the south corridor and clearly heard a sigh behind him, a long, drawn-out sigh, like a person who was utterly exhausted finally sitting down.
He spun around. The corridor had no lights, just pitch black. He stood there for a full 5 minutes. The sigh never came again. But the sweat on his back soaked through his padded jacket.
Old Sun said, after that, I took leave and went to Taishan Temple to burn a stick of incense. When I came back, I told my supervisor I couldn't do the night shift anymore. He asked why. I said, I'm getting old, nights are cold, my legs hurt. He paused, then said, I didn't dare tell the truth. I was afraid if I did, people would say I'd gone nuts from guarding a tomb.
Old Zhou, listening nearby, cut in, did burning the incense work?
Old Sun said, whether it worked or not, that thing never sighed again. But that stretch of corridor, I never walked it at night again, not once.
Old Sun also told me another thing. After he picked up that jade piece, he had the same dream 3 nights in a row. In the dream, he stood at the entrance of the south corridor, and at the far end of the corridor stood a child dressed in Han Dynasty clothing. He couldn't quite make out the face. The child waved at him. The first night, he woke up drenched in cold sweat. The second night, the same dream, the child waved again. The third night, in the dream, he took a step forward, and the child suddenly spoke. The voice was thin and hoarse. Keep the door locked.
Old Sun said he woke up with his pillow soaked through with sweat. He thought it over for a long time and couldn't figure out what the words meant. Later he switched to the day shift and never had that dream again. But he said he still remembers the child's voice to this day, like it came up from somewhere very, very deep, with an echo to it.
The main chamber of the Guishan Han Tomb, at the end of the corridor, was the largest room in the entire tomb. In the autumn of 2005, through the connections of a tour guide named Zhou, I went in to take a look one night. Zhou was a local girl from Xuzhou. She had been working as a tour guide here since the year the Han Tomb first opened, reciting the script until she knew it by heart. But she herself said she didn't really believe in all those ghostly and supernatural stories. She said, the most valuable thing in this tomb isn't gold, isn't silver, it's the sky overhead.
What she meant was the star map on the ceiling of the main chamber.
I followed her into the main chamber. She turned on an emergency light and shone it upward. I tilted my head back and was stunned on the spot. A winding groove had been chiseled into the stone ceiling, running from east to west, spanning the entire roof. The bottom of the groove was carved rough, catching the light in faint shimmering specks, like a river.
That was the Milky Way. 2,000 years ago, craftsmen had chiseled a Milky Way into the stone ceiling. On either side of the Milky Way were scattered round pits, some deep, some shallow, some dense, some sparse. Those were the star officials. According to the tour guide script, this star map corresponded to the astronomical observations of the Han Dynasty. The Milky Way carved into the ceiling of the main chamber meant, after the king of Chu died, he was buried beneath the stars, and heaven above and the mortal world below were one and the same. I stood there with my head tilted back, looking for a long time. Embedded in those chiseled grooves of the Milky Way were fine flakes of mica. When the light hit them, they sparkled, as if water were really flowing through. Zhou said experts had come to investigate several times and counted those star officials. They said the map corresponded to common Han Dynasty constellations, nothing special. Except for one spot, in the southeast corner of the main chamber, there was one extra star. This position didn't match any known star official. It stood alone, carved deep and round, as if it had been deliberately added.
The experts said perhaps a craftsman back then had made a mistake while carving, and after finishing, discovered there was one extra, but couldn't fix it, so it was left as is. Zhou said, but that star was carved so deep, so round, anyone could tell it was intentional. Tell me, would a man who spent 13 years building his own tomb carve a star that shouldn't exist into his own sky?
Xiao Zhao said, people of the Han Dynasty believed in serving the dead as you serve the living. Whatever house you lived in while alive, you'd live in the same kind after death. Lu Zhu had been the king of Chu for over a decade and spent 13 years building his tomb. He moved his entire kingdom of Chu into the mountain.
I said, then what about himself? What about his coffin?
Xiao Zhao said, it was looted long ago. More than once. It was robbed at the end of the Han Dynasty, and then again in every dynasty after that. When they blasted open the tomb passage in 1981, all that was left in the burial chamber were some pottery shards and broken bronze pieces. The coffins were gone long ago. Human remains? Not a single set was found.
I said, not even one?
Xiao Zhao said, not even one. Lu Zhu's, his wife's. All gone without a trace. Only the writing on the tomb walls remained. On the stone block sealing the passage entrance, an inscription was carved, written by Lu Zhu himself. The gist of it was, to the virtuous scholars and gentlemen of later generations, if anyone comes before my tomb, I am deeply ashamed. There is nothing of value in this tomb of mine. Please do not disturb me.
As I listened, I felt the back of my neck go cold.
A king of Chu who spent 13 years building his tomb, carving words into the stone that sealed it, begging grave robbers to let him be. But in the end, even his own bones were gone.
I said, then what, exactly, is buried in this tomb?
Xiao Zhao turned off the emergency light. The main chamber suddenly went pitch black, you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. In the darkness, she said one thing, a mystery is buried here. A 2,000-year-old mystery.
That night expedition in 2005 was originally meant to look at the star map, but what really stuck with me was the corridor on the way back.
After we finished in the main chamber, it was already past 10 at night. Xiao Zhao walked ahead, I walked behind, heading out along the corridor. The corridor had motion sensor lights. When you walked past, they turned on. When you walked past, they turned off. They lit up section by section, like someone was lighting the way for us up ahead. When we reached the mouth of the north corridor was the passage to the consort's tomb, normally closed off with a locked iron gate. Xiao Zhao suddenly stopped. She stood there, frozen. I walked over and saw her staring straight at the far end of the corridor, her face pale as a sheet.
I said, what's wrong?
She didn't speak. She raised her hand and pointed toward the end of the corridor. I followed her gaze. In the darkness at the far end of the corridor, a human silhouette was standing there. Dark and shadowy, pressed against the stone wall, not tall, like a child. When we looked at it, it seemed to be looking back at us. My head went blank in that moment, my legs nearly gave out. Xiao Zhao, on the other hand, was calmer than I was. She shouted, "Who's there?" The sound bounced around the corridor, echoing layer after layer. The shadow didn't move. Xiao Zhao shouted again, "Who's there? Come out." The shadow took 2 steps toward us. After 2 steps, it stopped. Then, just like that, it vanished, not running, not hiding, just gone, like a light going out. The 2 of us stood there, neither daring to move. After a long while, Xiao Zhao finally said, "Let's go. Hurry." We practically ran out of the corridor. Once outside, I crouched on the steps, gasping for air, while Xiao Zhao stood at the doorway, her face still white. A security guard heard the commotion and came over to ask what happened. Xiao Zhao said, "Nothing," the light flickered.
The guard said, "Oh, these cheap motion sensor lights, they break all the time. You got lucky catching it broken. We just fixed it a few days ago." Wait, that's not right. Aren't all the corridor lights supposed to be off tonight?
I still remember that guard's words to this day.
Later, Xuzhou was transferred away, moved over to the Lion Mountain Chu King's tomb to work as a docent. Before she left, we met once. I asked her, "That night, what exactly did you see?"
She was silent for a moment, then said, "Don't laugh at me when I tell you. That shadow, when it stepped across the corridor, there were no footprints on the ground. That stretch of floor in the corridor was dry, with a thin layer of dust on it. It walked across, and the dust stayed perfectly clean, not a single mark."
I said, "Maybe your eyes were playing tricks on you."
She said, "I wish it had been my eyes. But since that day, I've never walked at night again." She paused, then added, "There's one more thing I've never told anyone. That night when I shouted 'Who's there?' the shadow, its mouth moved."
It was like it had answered. Later, I asked Xuzhou about that night again. She said she'd thought about it for a long time, and the more she thought about it, the more wrong it felt. She said, when we came out of the main chamber, there were two of us, two sets of footsteps. But by the time we reached the mouth of the north corridor, she suddenly felt that the footsteps had become three. The extra one, neither heavy nor light, landed exactly in the gap between her footsteps and mine, keeping perfect pace with every step.
She said, "I didn't dare turn around at the time. The moment I turned around, I'd know it had been following us the whole way."
During my years in Xuzhou, I visited Hubu Mountain several times. Hubu Mountain sits in the center of Xuzhou's old city. During the Ming and Qing dynasties, it was the wealthy quarter of Xuzhou. High-ranking officials, salt merchants, and great families all built their mansions there. Poor North Gate, rich South Gate, the wealthy all live on Hubu Mountain. That old saying, every Xuzhou local knows it.
The old houses on Hubu Mountain are different from ones elsewhere. Elsewhere, old houses are timber-framed. But here, every house is gray brick with gray tiles, tall walls and deep courtyards, and the gate towers are covered in brick carvings, bats, peaches, pomegranates, packed tight, carved with meticulous care. Step inside and it's courtyard within courtyard, alleyways connecting to alleyways. Even in daytime it's gloomy in there, sunlight can't reach in, and moss grows in the corners year-round.
The old residents there say the old houses on Hubu Mountain all have thick walls, 1.5 feet warm in winter, cool in summer. But there's a catch to it too. Thick walls block off feng shui, and they block off other things as well. The older generation says that on Hubu Mountain, not a single house is clean. They're all old houses, lived in for centuries. Which family doesn't have something they can't quite explain?
Once, I was drinking tea in a tea house converted from an old Hubu Mountain residence, and I got to chatting with the old woman who looked after the place. She said that a few years back, when the house was being renovated, workers broke open a wall in the west wing and found the wall's core was hollow. Inside the cavity was a niche, not large, about a foot square. The niche was completely empty, nothing was enshrined in it. But the gray bricks in front of the niche were worn smooth and shiny, as if someone had knelt there every day, knelt for decades. The workers asked the old woman, what was enshrined in that niche? She said, I don't know. When I married into this family, that wall was already solid, nobody ever mentioned any niche. She said the workers eventually filled the niche in solid, but from then on, there were always sounds at night from the west wing, like someone on the other side of the wall, over and over, kowtowing.
The horse reviewing terrace is on Hubu Mountain too. That's where Xiang Yu reviewed his troops back in the day. Over 1,000 years ago, the hegemon king of Western Chu stood on that platform, reviewing his warriors from east of the river. Now the platform stands empty, just a stone foundation. Old Zhou once said something to me that I've remembered to this day. Xuzhou, this place 3 feet below ground, it's all Han Dynasty brick. Dig a foundation, you'll dig up terracotta figurines. Build a subway line, you'll dig up a Han tomb. Plant a tree in your courtyard, shovel 2 scoops, and you might just hit somebody's tomb roof. Over at Jiuli Mountain, there's also a folk rhyme handed down from the old folks. Before Jiuli Mountain lies an ancient battlefield. A cowherd picks up old swords and spears. The wind blows the waters of the Wu River, as if Yu were bidding farewell to the Hegemon king.
I asked Old Zhou, does Guishan count as part of Jiuli Mountain?
Old Zhou said, it does. Jiuli Mountain is a whole ridgeline. Guishan is a foot at its western end.
I said, then what's buried under Guishan? Is it truly the king of Chu, or something else?
Old Zhou didn't answer. He squatted at the door of his repair shop, tapped the oil drum on the ground with a wrench, knocked twice, and suddenly said, why do you think that mountain is called Guishan?
I said, because it looks like a turtle.
Old Zhou said, there are mountains in Xuzhou that look like all sorts of things, so why is it the only one called Turtle Mountain?
He paused, then said, a turtle holds back floodwaters, and it holds back evil too. When a turtle's back carries a steel, and the steel bears an inscription, that's called Bishi bearing the tablet. When the old folks chose burial sites, they cared about turtle and serpent meeting, and the turtle and crane bring longevity. The turtle is an omen of long life. But think of it the other way. A mountain that looks like a turtle, crouching there for millennia without moving. What is it pressing down on? The old folks say something is pressed beneath Guishan. That saying isn't an empty one. Go look at the sighting of the Guishan Han Tomb. The tomb is cut into the turtle's back, and the corridor faces due south, dead on, not a hair off. 2,000 years ago, the Fangshi geomancers measured it out step by step with their compasses. They chose this mountain not because it looked like a turtle, but because it can hold things down.
Hold what down? Old Zhou didn't say. He just tapped the oil drum once more and said, some sayings, the old folks passed them down. You listen, and that's all. Don't dwell on them. In 1996, the Guishan Han Tomb was undergoing waterproofing work, and workers were pouring waterproof layers in the tomb chambers and corridors. Back then, Old Zhou knew one of the bricklayers on the crew. The bricklayer's surname was Jiang, about 27 or 28, and everyone called him Xiao Jiang. Xiao Jiang was from Pei County. He was a good worker, but he was timid. When the crew worked overtime at night, he only ever took day shifts. But one time, to meet the deadline, the foreman specifically told him to stay for the night shift. He couldn't refuse, so he stayed. That night, after pouring one section of the corridor, they knocked off around 11. The workers filed out in 2s and 3s. Xiao Jiang lagged behind, going back to the corridor entrance to grab the bucket he'd left. As he reached the entrance, he heard the sound of footsteps inside, not heavy, one step at a time, unhurried, like someone pacing inside. Xiao Jiang figured one of the crew was still in there, so he called out, "Who's still in there?" "We're leaving." No answer. The footsteps didn't stop either. Xiao Jiang called again, "Stop dawdling, they're locking up." Still no answer. Xiao Jiang was getting annoyed, so he pulled out his flashlight and shone it inside. The corridor was empty, not a single person. But those footsteps were still going. Xiao Jiang said his head went blank in that moment. He turned and ran. When he got to the entrance, the foreman was locking up. Seeing how pale he was, the foreman asked what was wrong. He gasped for a long while, then said, "Inside, there's someone inside."
The foreman said, "Nonsense. You were the last one out. I was counting heads."
Xiao Jiang said, "Then listen, those footsteps are still going."
The foreman cocked an ear, listened, and cursed, "What footsteps? Your ears plugged up with donkey hair?"
Xiao Jiang said he heard it clearly, truly, in that moment. But the foreman couldn't hear it. He stood at the entrance, the footsteps sounding one by one, when suddenly they stopped. After a few seconds, they started again, this time, walking toward the opening. Step by step, closer and closer. Xiao Jiang said his legs went weak and he nearly fell to his knees. He grabbed the foreman. Let's go, hurry. The foreman, dragged along by him, locked the door while cursing, and the two of them went down the mountain. The next day, Xiao Jiang quit on the spot. The foreman asked him why. He said, those footsteps walked to the opening, then stopped. The door was locked, it couldn't get out. But I knew it was standing right behind that door, face to face with me through the door panel. Xiao Jiang later went back to Pei County and never worked a night shift again. Later still, I heard he'd gone to the city to drive a taxi, running both day and night. His wife said he couldn't bear to be idle, because the moment he was, he'd start pricking up his ears, listening. Old Zhou mentioned it to me once later, saying that one time Xiao Jiang's wife came into town and stopped by the repair shop to sit for a while. She talked about Xiao Jiang, sighed, and said, now when he drives at night and passes by Jiuli Mountain, he takes a detour. When I asked him why, he said he was afraid of hearing a sound. What sound? He wouldn't say. His wife said Xiao Jiang had only muttered about it to her once. He said that time in the corridor, what he heard wasn't footsteps. That sound was something being dragged. Like someone in the corridor was dragging something heavy, one pull at a time, hauling it deeper into the belly of the mountain. I lived in Xuzhou for 7 years, and in the spring of 2011 I was transferred back to Beijing. Before I left, I made one more trip to the Guishan Han Tomb.
By then, the Guishan Han Tomb had already become a popular tourist spot in Xuzhou. Tour groups came one after another, and the vendors at the entrance selling souvenirs and Han Dynasty stone relief rubbings made the place lively and bustling. Old Zhou was no longer at the foot of the mountain. He had passed away in the winter of 2010, a cerebral hemorrhage gone quickly. His repair shop was taken over by his nephew, who still kept the same ramshackle awning and the same greasy wrenches.
The caretaker had changed too, replaced by a young man. I can't even remember his surname anymore. I asked him, does the tunnel still act up?
He laughed and said, it does, every day. Too many tourists, the place is buzzing with voices, from morning till night. I laughed too. Then I asked, the scratches on the blocking stones, are they still there? He said, they are. Go take a look, the third one, lower right corner.
I walked to the entrance of the south tunnel. The 26 blocking stones looked just as they had all those years ago, dusty gray, the surfaces worn smooth by time and countless hands, carrying a layer of patina. The third blocking stone, lower right corner, had a scratch about half a chi long, grayish-white, standing out sharply against the dark stone surface. I crouched down and looked at it for a long time. That scratch was exactly as Old Zhou had described it to me back in 1992. 20 years had passed, yet it was still in the same spot, still the same length, still the same color, a fresh mark. No weathering, no aging, as if something had just scraped it out not long ago. The young caretaker crouched down next to me and took a look. He said, this scratch? The year before last, an expert from Beijing came to see it, and even he couldn't make sense of it. But he told me, when he was on night duty, one time he dozed off in the ticket office and dreamed that someone in the tunnel was shouting to open the door, shouting all night long. When he woke up, the iron gate was locked tight, but his enamel mug in the guard room had moved from the windowsill to the table, still half full of cold tea. He said that before he went to sleep, the mug had been empty.
I stood up and walked out. By the time I reached the tunnel entrance, the sun was just slanting west, and the pair of Chu King welcomes guests, reliefs carved on the cliff face, stood out clearly in the setting light. The taller one was slightly hunched, and the shorter one pressed close beside it.
Suddenly I remembered Old Zhou's words, that's not king and servant, that's king and shadow. I stood there looking for a good long while. Then I turned and walked out through the mountain gate. After I got back to Beijing, I didn't think about Guishan for years. That's just how people are, once you're far away, those things fade, like looking through a layer of fog, not quite clear. But in the winter of 2014, one night, I woke up at midnight and couldn't get back to sleep. I lay there scrolling through my phone and came across a news item, the Guishan Han Tomb in Xuzhou, a white shadow appearing in the tomb passage, surveillance footage sparking heated discussion online. I tapped it open. The video was shot by a tourist. In the passage, a gray-white shadow, pressed against the stone wall, blurry, like a human shape, or maybe a wisp of fog. In the video, voices were noisy and mixed. Someone said ghost, someone said refraction of light. Later, the official response came out, saying the white shadow was caused by the refraction of the motion sensor lights combined with moisture in the passage, purely a natural phenomenon. I watched it twice, turned off my phone, and lay there in the dark. Suddenly, I remembered what Old Zhou had said to me that year at the ticket office.
He said that after he picked up that piece of jade, he always felt like someone was following behind him. He said that thing didn't harm people, it just followed you. You walk, it walks. You stop, it stops. He said, it's not that it wanted to follow me. It stood at that doorway for thousands of years. Finally someone could see it, so it came along.
At the time, I thought Old Zhou had gotten paranoid from guarding the tomb. But now, in my home in Beijing, at 2 in the morning, remembering those words, I felt a chill run down the back of my neck. Old Zhou said something to me once too, while he was still alive. It was my last year in Xuzhou. I asked him, Old Zhou, what do you think is really buried in that tomb? He was squatting outside his repair shop, turning a screw, fiddling with it for a long time, and said, it's buried awaiting.
I said, waiting for what? He said, for a person. Waiting for someone who can hear.
I laughed at the time and said, you're talking like some mystic.
He didn't laugh. He said, remember what I'm telling you. What's buried in that tomb isn't Lu Zhu. Lu Zhu was just for show to the outside world. Think about it. 13 years of construction, a 56-meter passage, 5 millimeters of error, 26 ceiling stones, 6 tons apiece. 2,000 years ago, all that effort, just to bury a man whose tomb chamber was already stripped clean by robbers?
He said, that passage, who was it built for? Those ceiling stones, who were they meant to block? Those 2 figures, who were they standing for?
He had me stumped. He dusted the grime off his hands and said another thing, some tombs are for burying the dead. Some tombs are for burying the living. And some tombs are for burying secrets, burying one that the one down below must not hear.
I asked him, then what's really held underneath Guishan?
Old Zhou gave me a look and said, if you have to ask, then I'll tell you, I don't know. The ones who do know, they don't say. The next day, while Old Zhou was repairing a car, a reversing truck bumped into him. It wasn't serious, but he still spent half a month in the hospital. After he got out, he never brought up Guishan again. Whenever anyone asked, he'd say, I'm old and addled, can't remember anymore. In 2016, I went back to Xuzhou again. Not for Guishan, my company had a project there, so I was on a business trip, and I took the chance to visit the old town. Hubu Mountain looked the same as ever, blue brick, gray tiles, tall walls and deep courtyards. A stele stood atop Shima Terrace, and the wind was so strong it was hard to keep your eyes open. I sat in a tea house on Hubu Mountain for an entire afternoon, listening to 2 local old men chat. The conversation turned to the Guishan Han Tomb, and one of them said, that tomb at Guishan, it's cursed. The other asked, cursed how?
The first one said, haven't you heard? In that tomb both coffins empty, not a single bone. Tell me, a Chu king who spent 13 years building his tomb, dies and doesn't even leave his bones behind. Does that seem right? The other said, maybe grave robbers took them. The first one said, why would they take bones? Grave robbers want treasure. Gold and silver. Sure. Take it away. But who'd want a pile of bones? Unless there was never anyone buried there to begin with. He said, the old folks say that tomb was built for him to see. When it was finished, Lu Zhu was laid to rest, just going through the motions, and then the ceiling stones were shut. The real master entered the mountain through a different passage.
I sat nearby, holding my teacup, my hand trembling slightly. I wanted to ask where that different passage was, but I didn't get the words out. The tea house was busy with people coming and going. Sunlight streamed through the window lattice, warm and cozy, but my spine felt ice cold. That night I took a taxi back to where I was staying. The driver was a local Xuzhou man, in his 40s, talkative. When he heard I'd come from Beijing on business, he asked, "Been to Guishan?" I said I had. He said, "That place, Guishan, I'd advise you not to go at night." I asked why. He chuckled and said, "Anyone who works the night shift has run into things now and then." One winter, it was snowing, I picked up an old woman. She said she was going to Guishan. We got to the mountain gate, she got out, I was making change, I looked up, and she was gone. On the back seat, she'd left a sheet of yellow paper, folded into a neat square. The kind of yellow paper used for burning at graves. I picked it up, the paper was dry. But my back was soaked through in an instant.
He said, stuff like that of the night shift drivers in Xuzhou, 8 out of 10 have run into it. Can't explain it, and you don't dare dig too deep. He paused, then said, anyway, ever since that time, whenever I pass Guishan at night, I take the long way around.
The next day, near dusk, I went to Guishan again. The mountain gate was closed. I stood outside, looking through the iron fence. In the twilight, Guishan lay there dark and looming, head facing south, tail facing north, utterly still. As the last thread of light in the west faded, a thought struck me. This mountain has been lying here for 2,000 years. The secret it's pressing down on, will anyone ever know it again? I don't know. All I know is that when I left that day, the pair of stone lions at the mountain gate, their eyes were fixed on me. After I got back to Beijing, I wrote about the Guishan affair in my diary. At the end, I wrote this: the light that turned on by itself in that passageway, the jade fragment old sun picked up, the footsteps Xiao Jiang heard, the shadow Xiao Zhao saw, they aren't separate things. They're one and the same thing. It's the person under the mountain, who's been waiting for 2,000 years, trying to say something to the world outside. That sentence he's been saying for 2,000 years, I don't know if anyone has ever heard it. The story's over. What do you think? If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe. New urban legend every day.